Welcome to the Whole Counsel Podcast. I'm John Snyder, and we're starting a new series, and we mentioned it last week, a series that covers some of the greatest Christian letter writers in the last 5 centuries. And so we're kind of struggling to come up with a title for this. I think we'll call it Letters That Continue to Speak. We're really focusing on those letters from key believers, men and women, through the centuries. Letters that carried, lasting truth that applies to every generation and not just to a specific group of people. We're not going to be looking at these in any specific order. On the table here, you'll see that I have a number of books that have letters in them, whether it's Newton's letters to his wife or Rutherford's letters or Lloyd Jones or Chalmers. We have some others that we haven't put up here as well, William Carey's and Amy Carmichael. But we'll be looking at these, and we'll give you a quick intro to each of the authors as we look at their letters, and just hit one or two of those to kind of give you a taste for their writing. And if you're interested in that, then you can find those letters for yourself. We'll also be doing a couple of giveaways throughout this series, and some of these books are no longer in print. Some we've been able to find. So if we're able to find them, we will make that available as a giveaway. And we have a couple for John Newton that we'll be showing you next week. We also want to direct you for John Newton, who we'll be looking at today, to the link below. If you click that, it'll take you to the video footage that comes from the study, The Weight of Majesty. In that study, when we traveled and looked at Christians from history that help us to see the significance of studying the character of God, we looked at John Newton. And we did 2 introductory sessions on Newton. So Teddy's put those together for us. So if you want to see kind of just some highlights from Newton's life, filmed on location of where he pastored, both in Olney and then in London, you can hit that link and go to it. So this week, we're going to begin to look at Newton's letters, and we'll stay here for a while because Newton really is one of the greatest Christian letter writers. His letters are very pastoral. They're mentoring and guiding people, through the post, one historian said. Newton's letters are particularly simple and clear, practical, but they are also very warm and penetrating. Now, I think that Newton's letters, when it comes to pastoring someone or guiding or mentoring someone, I think these are the best. They're different than my other favorite letter writer, and that's Samuel Rutherford. Rutherford's letters are also letters of a pastor back to his people when he was under house arrest in Aberdeen. Not able to be with his people, he tried to shepherd them through the post. The difference between Rutherford and Newton is that Rutherford's letters soar higher in their expressions of what he's learning about Christ and all that Christ is for the believer. But Rutherford's letters are not quite as simple, direct, and practical as Newton's. Now, Newton was at the heart of the latter half of the Great Awakening. That's what we call it here, or the Evangelical Revival. From 1780 till his death in the early 1800s, Newton began to devote a lot of his time to writing letters because as a minister in the last couple of decades of the Evangelical Revival, Newton became the hub of so many other like-minded men scattered throughout the denominations in the UK and in America. And it was through letter writing that so many of these men remained connected to each other, even though they might have ministered hundreds and thousands of miles apart. Unlike many of the other authors here, Newton actually published some of his letters, and they weren't just gathered and published after his death, because he states that he recognizes that it wasn't his preaching so much, but his letters, that he felt that God in particular used to bring real spiritual benefit to people. So he wrote these letters, but also he either gathered them back from the people or he had copies that he'd made, and he published them. And if you look at his works, here's an example of it's an older edition, the works of John Newton, Volume 1. Volume 1 and 2 in this edition contain his letters, and they're published under two different titles. There's two sets of letters that were published in his lifetime. One is called 41 Letters on Religious Subjects by Omicron and Vigil. Now, Omicron and Vigil were two pseudonyms that Newton used when he wrote letters, and it would be published perhaps in the evangelical magazine of the day, and he would just sign it using one of these names so as not to draw attention to himself. But you might remember that we mentioned in a previous podcast that one of Newton's friends wrote him a letter and said, it doesn't matter what name you use to sign these letters, I recognized my friend John Newton's writing. And so even though they were published under these false names, eventually he gathered them and published them in a book, 41 letters. The second collection of letters that were published during his lifetime were called Cardiphonia, or that's the Latin word for utterance of the heart. And the full title was The Utterance of the Heart in the Course of a Real Correspondence. So these were letters that were actually written to people, but they were gathered later and put together for print. Cardiphonia, by the way, is the title that Newton chose, but it wasn't original to him. His good friend, William Cowper. You might remember that Cowper and Newton were very close friends, and Newton helped Cowper as much as he could through dealing with the mental disease that he suffered. Newton took the suggestion from Cowper and named it Utterances of the Heart, or Cardiphonia. Now, what we want to look at today, and we'll do these rather quickly, is just one letter. It's actually the second letter in that first volume. It's a letter written to a student in divinity, or what we would say today in seminary, in the study of theology. So a young man apparently has written John Newton, and he's concerned. And his main concern is that his knowledge, head knowledge, is outpacing the sanctification of his heart. That experiential, or what the 18th century men called the experimental knowledge of God. So his head is growing, his understanding is growing through reading all these books and studying at a seminary or at a university in preparation for the ministry. But he's concerned that his heart isn't being as affected. So he writes John Newton and he asks him for advice. Is this the best way to prepare for the ministry? And do you have any counsel for me? And Newton does. Newton starts the letter by saying that he's glad that the man is bothered because he hopes the Lord will use this concern that the young man feels to direct the young man in the best paths preparing for the ministry. And Newton mentions that he has noticed that men going off to seminary often are not benefited by studying at the institution. And sometimes it has a negative impact. And this is what he writes. Though I am no enemy to the acquisition of useful knowledge, I have seen many instances of young men who have been much hurt by what they expected to reap advantage from. They have gone to the academy humble, peaceable, spiritual, and lively. But they have come out differently, he says. They're dogmatic, censorious, full of a prudence founded upon the false maxims of the world, so a worldly wisdom. He writes, I do not mention this as the necessary fault of the institution itself, but as the frequent effect of notions that are too hastily picked up when not sanctified by grace, nor balanced by a proportionable depth of spiritual experience. So Newton goes on in the letter to give what he feels is his best advice to a young student in this situation. And so he says, it's not the institution's fault that it does not make you a man of God, because no institution with great professors and the best books could do that. It takes the work of the Lord. And he warns him, it is by the working of the Spirit that a man is equipped to serve as a minister of the gospel. But that raises some questions. And in this letter, Newton raises and answers two particular questions. And the first question is this: how far is it right to expect the Spirit's assistance in preparing for the ministry? And his answer to this question is, it is right to lay the whole stress upon the work of the Spirit. So how far are we to expect the Spirit to work and to depend on the Spirit's work in our preparation? Newton says, put all your hope on the Spirit. And he mentions John 15:5, that Christ says to the disciples, he's the vine, they're the branches, they must abide in him, and he will abide in them, because apart from him, they can do nothing. Newton says, if we do not have the work of the Spirit equipping us to serve, and we can think of pastors, of course, but we can think of any believer that's sharing with others, parents sharing with children, neighbors with their neighbors, mentoring a younger believer in a discipling way. Newton says, without the work of the Spirit, you just darken counsel without knowledge. Now he gives a hypothetical. Imagine a young man who has studied enough and he's been diligent enough in his seminary studies to master a systematic theology. He really understands how these things fit together. And so he secretly feels that he can do well enough in teaching a class with all this acquired knowledge now, with all of his books and his training, even without the Spirit's help, though he admits that he would do better with the Spirit. Newton says he could not congratulate that person's achievement. And that's a trap that we can all fall into. We can think of, perhaps for us, it's not preaching, but maybe teaching a children's Sunday school class, and we feel, well, I'm sufficient for that. Or speaking to a neighbor about the Lord, and they know nothing about the Bible. They don't know the gospel at all. And you think, well, I'm sufficient for that. I know the basics. If they ask me hard questions, I might be stumped. But, I've read enough, and I've been in church enough, and I think I can handle it. And Newton warns us that that's a really easy trap to fall into, but not one you want to be in. The second question that follows is this: how far can dependence on the Spirit rightfully replace our use of means? The hard work of study. And his answer is this: not in the least. That is, depending on the Spirit cannot in any way replace the right use of the tools that God has given us for studying and understanding his word. Newton says in this letter, the blessing and the means are so closely united that they cannot be separated. In other words, we can only expect the Spirit's work and his effective impact to be added to our humble and diligent use of the means, or study of Scripture and of the truths of Scripture. And we cannot expect the Spirit's help apart from our doing our part in this work. We have to be diligent, he says. And then he describes what he means by diligence, and it's a great definition. He says this: by diligence, I understand a spiritual diligence. That is, an active, improving, industrious habit. As is peculiar to a heart impressed with some real, abiding sense of the love of God, the worth of souls, the shortness of time, and the importance of eternity. So that's quite a definition. Let me read it again. Spiritual diligence is active. It is improving, so we're progressing in knowledge. It is industrious, hard work. And he says it's the kind of activity that is peculiar to a heart that's impressed with the sense of the love of God, the worth of souls, the shortness of time, and the importance of eternity. And then he warns, without this turn of mind, though a man should spend 16 hours every day in his study, he may be a mere trifler. And in other words, you can read all the theological books you want. You can memorize Scripture and you can prepare lessons. But if your heart is not engaged because you are in the grip of those realities that he mentioned, even though you may be outwardly studious, he said, you won't really benefit from those studies. Now, Newton follows in the letter with a number of things that he feels are significant sources, significant tools that the Lord gives us to prepare ourselves or to improve our understanding of theology and the truths of Scripture, how they fit together, which of those has greater weight and which is more of a supporting truth. And he gives two chief means, and then he gives a list of lesser means. So the first chief means, and it's kind of a double. He says Scripture and prayer, and we're not surprised to hear him say that. This is how he describes it. Scripture and prayer. One, that is the Scripture, is a fountain of living water. The other is the bucket, which we use to draw the water from Scripture. So Scripture and prayer, and he talks in his letter, we won't take the time, he just spends time just talking about the fact that a man that will devote himself to that, a woman that will devote herself to that, in the years to come, there's a distinct difference. They really make progress in the understanding of the Lord. The second of the chief means might be a little more surprising to us. He says meditation. Now, he then goes on to say, by this, I don't mean stated seasons of meditation, like meditating on the Scriptures, but he uses that word to describe kind of a lifestyle of being aware and thoughtful, of being mindful regarding all the things that are happening in your life and the things that are happening in the lives of people around you. And so Newton basically is counseling this young man, pay attention to what you see, not only in how God deals with you, but in how God deals with other believers, because if you can learn from the everyday circumstances, the ups and downs that you and others go through, then it gives you, he says, a large supply of wisdom that you will be able to use alongside the Scriptures to illustrate them, to kind of to help you to know how to apply those to the different situations. Now, the subordinate means. He says, well, you can give yourself to a certain degree of study of classical learning. And in that category, he mentions the ancient languages. Now, he's not talking about Hebrew and Greek here, but Latin and French and German and whatever other languages that in Newton's day might have been considered essential for those who want to be properly educated. But also, he said, the study of history and the study of nature. These are desirable, he said, but they are desirable if they're kept subservient to the Bible in your labors to prepare for the ministry. They must not engross too much of your time, and they must not, he says, be allowed to become a fuel for your pride, for growing in self-importance, which, he said, is the temptation of every person as we study the classics and, we gain a little knowledge. The classics can sharpen our thinking. They can enlarge our view of things, our grasp of things, and they can give us a better ability to express ourselves in a way that is genuinely beneficial and appropriate. It reminds me of a letter that McShane wrote, not John Newton, but Robert Murray McShane, about 40 years later, when he said to a young student at university, he said, study the classics, but use them like a chemist does a dangerous poison. You can use it, but don't imbibe it. Don't let it get into your bloodstream. A second subservient means or tool that Newton recommended to the young man studying for the ministry was the original languages of the Scripture. But he warns him that you must never think that just because you can explain the Greek or Hebrew grammar and the original meaning of the word and kind of fill it out as you can when you know the original languages, do not mistake that for really understanding and having mastered the spiritual realities that these words represent. He said to have that full grasp of the truth, you must derive that from your experiential knowledge. In other words, taking those truths, applying in your life, living on them. And God is teaching you, or as one old Puritan said, catechizing your heart as you're living out these truths. And not just by your own experiential knowledge of the Bible, but through the influence and teaching of the Spirit of God. Third of his secondary things that a man needs is, he says, well, you can study logic. And this will help you to understand, in particular for someone who's teaching, it helps you to understand what points are essential to your sermon, to your passage, and what points can be left out. And he says that's of great help, because kind of a lazy, wandering sermon that just kind of talks in circles doesn't do anyone much good. But to know what should be left out and what should be emphasized, logic is a really great help here. And he says, now, you want to make sure that your thinking is careful and clear so that you can communicate clearly. But he said, guard yourself against the opposite error of becoming a person who, because of your study of logic, you become overly strict and precise in your sermons, and they become artificial and dry and cold. Finding the balance, he warns, will take time. It will take experience and observation and prayer. Another tool to use, learn from mature believers around you. He says you can learn a lot from believers, dead ones and living ones. So you can read biographies and you can talk to older, more mature believers that are around you right now. But strangely, Newton says, give more time to the living, not just the dead. Speak much with experienced Christians, he says, who have passed through a variety of seasons, circumstances in the Christian life and have walked with God through all of them. They will have a great deal to teach you. A fifth tool that he mentions is learning from ministers that God has particularly used in the world, particularly blessed them. Listen to their sermons, note their strengths, note their gifts, where do they really seem to be most effective, and note their weaknesses. And he says, and when you listen to them, don't just go to the ministers in your denomination, but go to godly ministers in every denomination. Don't be a slavish admirer, he says, of any single minister. For Jesus is the master and teacher and pattern for every preacher. As for preaching, Newton said that he found that if he could just get his heart in the right frame, and if he were able to enjoy a real liberty in prayer as he approached the sermon, then he found that everything else tended to fall in place after doing this studying. He did warn about a couple of other things, motivation and humility. For motivation, he said this. He said, make sure you can examine your own heart and truly say that your motive for all your labors, all your studying, all your speaking, is to promote the glory of our Redeemer and the good of his people. And when he speaks of humility, he says, never forget that even at your best, after decades of walking with the Lord and serving the Lord, perhaps as a pastor or in some official capacity, with all your gathering of knowledge, your library, your experience, never forget that at your best, you are a cistern, you're a bucket, you're a container, not a river. Never, he says, never trust your gifts that God has given you, the abilities you have, even after 20 or 30 years in the ministry. Because after decades of being used by God, you are still as insufficient for your work, if left to yourself, as you were the very first day you attempted it. So, he says, don't despair, but rejoice in the fact that God has commanded you and given you the liberty to come to him, the fountain of help that is always full and flowing. So he writes this warning, if you lean upon books or men, or upon your own abilities and attainments, you will be in constant fear and danger of falling. Well, let me give you a final quote before we leave this letter. Newton says, a comfortable freedom for public service, being able to really delight in serving the Lord in a public way, in a way that, involves teaching or guiding, It depends much on the spirituality of your walk before God and before the people. If it is our business, he writes, and our pleasure to contemplate Jesus and to walk in his steps, he will bless us. We will be like trees planted by a constant stream, and he will prosper the work of our hands. Well, that's the end of the letter. You can go back and you can see in our show notes, you can see where you can read that letter. But it's a pretty long letter, 8 or 9 pages in this copy. If you would like to read more of what John Newton says to young men in particular who are studying for the ministry or who have just entered the ministry, and Newton really shines here, then you can look at his works. You can look at Cardiphonia or the letters that were collected under the names Omicron and Vigil. You can look those up online. Teddy will give you some information in the show notes. Or you can go and buy his works, and volume 1 and 2 of the 6-volume set. I think it's out in a 4-volume set now. And if that's so, they may all be in volume 1. But you can look there and you can find that he writes to ministerial men many times, and there's just too many for us to stop and cover them all. Well, again, if you want to learn more about John Newton, you can go to the link in the show notes, and that will take you to the material that we filmed about Newton in the study, Behold Your God, the Weight of Majesty. Also, in preparation for next week, if you want to kind of get ahead, we want to give you the letter in advance. So the letter for next week is a letter where John Newton, it's one of actually 3 letters, where he speaks about the stages of the Christian life, of just the early days, kind of then the middle years, and then spiritual maturity. And he gives the struggles of each of those stages. What do they look like generally? And what are some of the strengths of each of those stages of growth? And how do we appreciate that, whether we're in the midst of it or looking at someone else who is in that time? So that letter will be in the show notes below as well.